By mid-July 1944, the sky over Normandy had become a new kind of front line, an endless humming factory in motion. The Allies were no longer sending lone aces out to duel. They were launching waves, thousands of sorties every day, a sustained industrial tempo that turned the air into an omnipresent weapon. When a single road becomes visible to tens of thousands of aircraft sightlines, the calculus of warfare changes. A general who had made his reputation by moving among his troops by sensing the battlefield at eye level and forcing decisions with presence and speed, found himself exposed to an arithmetic he could not outmaneuver. This is the story of one such exposure. A routine drive down a sunlit road on July 17, 1944, a 3-second burst from fighter bombers, and the sudden incapacitation of Erwin Rommel, a moment that illuminated how 13,000 sorties a day could overwhelm a commander's defense. Erwin Rommel was, in military terms, a man of motion. His reputation had been earned in deserts and open fields where speed and initiative mattered more than massed weight of material. He preferred to judge a situation by walking along distant lines, by speaking directly with the sergeants and corporals who understood the ground. The image of Rommel that circulated among his men, the man who drove himself along front roads, who arrived where problems were worst, who trusted instinct and improvisation over static plans, fit the model of a commander who could close gaps by force of will. For decades, that model had been plausible. Commanders who could read a battlefield, arrive in time and order quick counterattacks, could keep enemy thrusts localized, and salvage positions that rigid staff work might have surrendered. But Normandy in the summer of 1944 was not the open terrain that had allowed Rommel's style to flourish. The Atlantic Wall was a myth increasingly apparent under inspection. Fortifications were often incomplete, troops were thinly spread along a long front, and supplies, fuel, armored vehicles, even simple repair parts, were scarce or arriving too slowly. Allied air power, operating at an intensity unseen earlier in the war, multiplied the problem. Reconnaissance planes and fighter bombers made movement by daylight perilous. Convoys that once could roll with tenuous security now crawled under the threat of strafing and rocket attack. The German emphasis on mobile, localized response confronted a new reality. The sky itself had become a conveyor belt of lethality that could find, strike, and interrupt movement before a commander on the ground could respond. The Allies reached this point not by luck, but by a deliberate systemic effort. Factories in Britain, the United States, and Canada had been retooled and ramped up to produce aircraft at scale. Training programs had expanded, so that pilot throughput increased. Technical schools turned raw recruits into functioning air crews at a sustained pace. Logistics pipelines supplied fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts. When historians talk about industrial warfare, they do not mean only the raw numbers, though those numbers are striking. By certain accounts, the Anglo-American air effort in July 1944 approached tens of thousands of sorties a week, a daily tempo that turned the sky into a persistent pressure on the battlefield. Fighter bombers, the so-called JBO conversions like the Typhoon or certain configurations of the Spitfire, were optimized for low-altitude attacks on moving targets. Their armament, often including the Hispano 20mm cannon, made short, concentrated bursts devastatingly effective against soft targets and unarmored vehicles. These aircraft did not hunt for prestige. They hunted for targets of opportunity. Any engine, any convoy, any staff car that betrayed its movement on a bright day. The distinction between the age of the ace and the age of the sortie is crucial. In earlier phases of the war, a handful of skilled pilots could dominate local airspace. Their actions shaped battles. By 1944, air superiority was an aggregate phenomenon. Individual heroics mattered less than the steady ability to put dozens, hundreds, then thousands of missions into the air with predictable tempo. When hundreds of aircraft sweep the sky in a sustained pattern, the odds of a staff car being spotted, of its dust trail betraying it against a sunlit road, increased to the point where anonymity predominates. A pilot on patrol could see a target, attack with routine procedures, and file a routine report. The pilot would not know which life he had touched. The system did not require him to. Rommel's movements along the front in Normandy reflected his operational doctrine. He believed being present, personally assessing terrain and morale, could create solutions others might not see. On July 17, 1944, after a tense meeting, he set out along a country road known as the N-179. The car he rode in was a staff vehicle, open top, low profile, a modest convoy in appearance. The day itself offered the kind of visibility that, to air crews, made small objects stand out like targets on a chessboard. Sunlight glinted off metal. A dust trail marked the car's progress. The vehicle's driver, a sergeant named Daniel in the reports that followed, had habits, slight swerves to avoid ruts, a penchant for hugging vegetation to obscure the profile when possible. Those habits had protected them before, but on that day they were small adjustments in a larger probabilistic game. Far above, within the routine of patrols flown over the Normandy hedgerows, pilots scanned the landscape for movement. The aircraft involved that afternoon were part of the broader Allied effort to keep the front from consolidating. The pilots were executing a standard engagement profile. Some accounts attribute the attack to a patrol of converted fighters, possibly operating under an RAF unit noted in some records as Number 602 Squadron. One pilot's report later used the call sign Charlie Fox, but exact squadron names and pilot identities in brief combat reports can be ambiguous and later subject to archival verification. What is not ambiguous, in broad terms, is what those pilots were doing. Looking for moving targets, diving for the kill, and returning to base to prepare for the next sortie. The next sequence is short and visceral in its tempo but spare in its detail when stripped of sensational color. A pilot sees a target. The aircraft angles for a shallow dive. The sound of the engine climbs in pitch as throttle and gravity accelerate it. Through the cockpit, the pilot lines up a burst. The weapons are designed to be fired in very short intervals. Seconds, not minutes, because those seconds are when targets at low altitude expose their vulnerabilities. A 3-second burst from Hispano cannons can shred a car's structure, disable its engine, and strike those inside with lethal force. The bullets and shells that hit the vehicle do not discriminate by rank. They are the product of a system that turns speed and mass into concentrated moments of violence. The staff car took the burst. Reports later described the vehicle as riddled and Rommel severely wounded. Captain Helmuth Lang, one of the aides present, was seriously injured. Sergeant Daniel, the driver, suffered wounds as well. The car crashed. Personnel scrambled. Those immediate reactions read like the ordinary chaos of combat. Stretcher teams, urgent signals, a scramble to secure the area, to assess casualties, to contact higher command. For the pilot, the action might have remained a line in a logbook. Staff car engaged, observed to be disabled. For the German command, it was the sudden loss of a central node. The medical consequences were formal and harsh. Rommel endured significant injuries that required evacuation and extended treatment. Physically incapacitated, he could no longer move rapidly along the front, could not insert his presence into the decision cycles that had defined his approach. Where before his arrival at a threatened sector might have inspired or directed an improvised counter, that ability evaporated. The field marshal's incapacitation did not by itself overturn German defenses, yet it removed a flexible improvisational layer of command at a moment when such flexibility had outsized value. Units that had been holding by tenuous local initiative suddenly lacked the organizing center that could coordinate swift localized responses. The operational consequences unfolded in both immediate and compounding ways. Rommel's absence coincided with the Allies pressing their advantages. Sustained interdiction of German movement, concentrated offensives at vulnerable junctions, and constant aerial harassment that kept reserves from repositioning quickly. Where commanders were needed to patch gaps, to coordinate counterattacks, to reallocate fuel and armor, the chain of command was frayed. The Wehrmacht's ability to assemble coherent, multi-divisional responses degraded under the combined effect of air interdiction, logistical shortages, and the loss of a commanding presence who in prior months had been able to hide shortages with audacious maneuvers. Beyond the operational picture, the political consequences within Germany's political military apparatus were profound. In the immediate aftermath, the conspiracies and paranoia that had long simmered within the regime found new avenues. The assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20th, merely 3 days after Rommel's wounding, intensified a climate of suspicion. The Gestapo and other elements of the regime reacted with sweeps and purges. Anyone whose loyalties were in question found themselves under scrutiny. Rommel, a celebrated and internationally known field marshal, was caught in this vortex. He had neither orchestrated the July 20th plot nor sought to be a political actor, but his reputation and his connections made him a figure of interest. Within months, the regime forced Rommel into a corner. Presented with a choice framed as an option in the sanitized language of the time, he was compelled to take his own life to avoid the public spectacle of a trial that would have illuminated splits within the officer corps. His death was therefore both a personal tragedy and a symptom of a broader political breakdown. That sequence, a burst from the sky, a physical incapacitation, the tactical disintegration of local responses, and then a political unraveling, illustrates an uncomfortable truth about modern industrialized warfare. A single pilot's action, routine in itself, became a lever for larger systemic effects precisely because it operated inside a saturated space of air power. When the Allies were capable of sustaining thousands of sorties per day, the chance that any given movement by day would be detected and struck approached inevitability. The air did not need to be perfect, it just needed tempo. Probability did the rest. This is not to say that individual competence or leadership became irrelevant. Commanders still mattered, as did the temperament to make rapid decisions under pressure. But the kinds of decisions that once swung battles, the audacious dash to a threatened point, the immediate counterthrust coordinated on personal authority, were now more likely to be preempted by a sky that could find and disrupt the mechanical means by which that authority moved. In that sense, the heroic age of the general, the notion that presence alone could compensate for material shortages, gave way to a different logic. The engineer's logic of production, throughput, and redundancy. Factories and training schools, fuel pipelines and maintenance yards had become the decisive instruments. The cumulative effect of thousands of sorties created a political and operational environment in which commanders could no longer rely on presence to substitute for capacity. There is an irony in Rommel's example that historians have not failed to note. A man who prized speed and local initiative was felled, not by a grand strategic masterstroke or the failure of his tactical acumen, but by the relentless arithmetic of massed air operations. The attack that wounded him was not a cinematic, planned assassination. By the weight of available evidence, it reads as an encounter, shaped by routine patrolling and probability. That ambiguity is itself instructive. When industrial systems saturate a battle space, individual stories blend into statistical outcomes. The identity of a single pilot fades behind the data point of sorties flown, ammunition expended, and engines aloft. For the men on the ground, however, the statistical facelessness had intimate consequences. A single blast could remove the person whose authority had been the glue for local coordination. The battlefield felt that loss sharply. One can trace direct operational effects in Normandy that followed. Plans for counterattacks that had counted on Rommel's capacity to marshal reserves and reorder defensive priorities were delayed or abandoned. Communication lines strained as staff officers tried to fill gaps. Units at the tactical edge waiting for orders that came too late or not at all found themselves isolated. The armies on both sides reacted not only to localized losses but to a dawning recognition that movement under daylight was fragile, that coordination relied increasingly on radio and pre-planned schedules rather than on the personal arbitration of a nearby commander. This shift in decision-making architecture favored forces that could maintain logistic depth, air cover, and redundancy, precisely the advantages the Allies had forged. It is also necessary to place the episode in the broader moral and political context. Rommel was a German general within a regime responsible for crimes of vast scale. A historical account that focuses exclusively on battlefield mechanics risks flattening moral contours. The aim here is not to celebrate Rommel as a hero in a moral sense, but to analyze how his wounding exemplifies the broader transformation in warfare, the displacement of individual tactical brilliance by systemic industrial power. The human cost, the wounded aides, the drivers, the nurses who treated them, is part of that transformation. The system produced both strategic advantage and individual suffering. The two are inseparable. From a tactical point of view, The weapons involved underscore the mechanical character of the strike. The Hispano 20mm cannon, a standard armament on many fighter aircraft, delivered high rates of fire and explosive shells, effective against lightly armored targets. In the low-altitude environment over Normandy, where trees and hedgerows offered fragmented cover and where small roads funneled movement, such armament made short strafing runs both lethal and efficient. Fighter bombers did not need extended loiter time. They required repeated short interactions, a tempo of strikes that, over weeks and months, prevented the enemy from regaining the freedom of movement to execute intricate countermaneuvers. Each mission contributed to cumulative attrition of vehicles, of fuel stocks, of morale. And yet, for all the cold mechanics, the day's events registered as a human rupture. Rommel's convalescence removed an improvisational spine from a defensive effort already stretched thin. The consequences were felt not only in maps and after-action reports but in the decisions of commanders who had relied on his presence. The human network of trust, habit, and immediate command evaporated in part, and with it some capacity for ad hoc rescue operations that might have slowed an Allied squeeze. Where the mechanized logic of sortie volume prevailed, the idiosyncratic skill of an individual commander could not recreate lost scale. The political fallout that followed, the July 20th plot, the harsh reprisals, the forced death of a field marshal, completes the chain by which an aerial engagement bleeds into national politics. The regime's reaction to perceived internal division turned tactical misfortune into political hazard. Rommel's fate, shaped by wounds that incapacitated him and by a regime that demanded symbolic loyalty, illustrates the interplay between battlefield events and regime stability. In that sense, the July 17th episode did more than remove a commander from the line. It accelerated pre-existing tendencies toward collapse within the German command environment. What, then, is the larger lesson? The incident on the N-179 is a concentrated case study in the shift from personal command to systemic capacity. When air power is organized and resourced at industrial scale, probability, not chivalry, becomes the decisive factor. The more sorties you fly, the more likely incidental encounters will yield strategic results. A 3-second burst becomes, in aggregate, a tool for shaping the battlefield. A war fought at those tempos privileges factories. It privileges logistics and training pipelines. It privileges the discipline of redundancy over the charisma of a single commander. That is a sober, even elegiac observation. The image of a man who once stormed across deserts, who trusted momentum and personal presence, lying wounded by a country road captures a larger mourning. The end of a certain type of battlefield agency. The age when generals could move the line with a decisive personal appearance faded into an age when industrial throughput dictated the tempo of warfare. Fields of battle became three-dimensional theaters where the sky could reach down with routine efficiency and reshape outcomes that once turned on singular acts of daring. This is not a deterministic claim that material advantage always decides history in a moral vacuum. Strategy, intelligence, and human decision still matter. But a commander's toolbox shifted radically in July 1944. Against a sky saturated with sorties, the options narrowed. The calculus of risk changed. To move was to invite detection. To hold was to risk attrition without reinforcement. To counterattack without air superiority was perilous. Those constraints made many bold maneuvers untenable and rewarded patient accumulation and coordinated logistics. As we step back from the particular and examine the architecture behind it, the title's stark assertion becomes clearer. The shocking moment was not merely the wounding of one man. It was the instant where an industrialized sky turned a general's movement into a statistical inevitability. 13,000 sorties a day is not just a number. It is a mode of war that converts motion into vulnerability and makes anonymity the instrument of consequence. That is how the air, multiplied by factories and pipelines, overwhelmed what had until then been a reliable method of defense. Finally, the human dimension insists on a small essential humility. Systems, even brutal and efficient ones, are made up of people. The pilot on patrol, the mechanics repairing engines in a field strip, the clerks who scheduled a sortie, all participated in a process that had distant effects on lives. When historians measure sortie rates and compute probabilities, they must remember that those statistics intersect with flesh and fate. Rommel's wounding on that sunlit road remains a stark illustration. One moment where the mathematics of industrial war met the contingencies of human movement and created a result whose implications rippled across the battlefield and into the political heart of a collapsing regime. If this episode raises a question in your mind, could one surviving commander have changed the outcome in Normandy? Leave your thoughts below. And if you want a deeper look at how logistics and production shaped the course of World War II, watch our video on that subject next.